How is everybody? Hello. Fabian. I think we have everybody we need here. Get the conversation going. So the discussion on whether to use schemas or not. And it looks like Tong has already added a comment about experimenting with table names. I just saw that, so I'm not up to date. So thoughts on schema or not schema?
I think to sort of answer that question, we have to sort of take a step back, which is in our test suite and development environments, how are we going to enforce that a given table that we have isolated cannot use, say, cross-boundary joins? Let's not call them cross-shard or cross-database, because this immediately sort of locks us into the next step. But basically, at a code level, let's say we move, for this case, let's say we move the users table. How would we enforce that somebody doesn't add, for example, new foreign keys or joins that table onto something that may not be available? Because I think if we start there, the choice of using different schemas or different database or whatever it is, that's basically a solution to this question. So I think we should basically start there. I can answer part of that. I think for foreign keys, we could disallow foreign keys to be added in migrations for certain tables. We have some similar bits and pieces in place where I think certain tables you're not allowed to add indexes, I think, or add columns, something like that, because they're basically too big. Joins and such are a little more difficult because there's no way I think you can statically detect those.
I mean, you would have to drop or rename tables to make them invalid, or parse executed SQLs to really like to find if you are using, I guess, then listed set of tables. But I think this is like the same challenge, like that. Doing these things on the dev and test kind of breaks the way how you even migrate that, because maybe for the test on each run test we open transactions, so probably we can do these DDL changes within a transaction, they will be rolled back, but it's not so straightforward if you want to kind of replicate the same for the development. Running of the DB migrate, if people will migrate schemas, would also change structure SQL. So you will kind of end up very often, at least from my head, like in the state that from the development database, the structure SQL would not be equal to what is committed in the repo, because you would have to make some changes to the structure to kind of enforce that forbidden constructs cannot be used. And this would be either drop tables or rename them or do something different that I'm not aware of currently. That's really my perspective on the alternatives. If we don't do schema, there is like a workaround, which is like drop or rename, which kind of like if you drop or rename, like you can, even for the foreign keys, you can discover that you are foreign keying to table in a different context based on the name or comment of the table. and like we could probably discover a lot of these things, but you kind of need to like reduce or like change your perspective of the your view of the database effectively.
Put it this way. Basically, regardless of the approach we end up with, we need a way of, at the very least in our tests, having a restriction on these tables. So we pick a list of tables. We say, okay, for these tables, during tests, let's say migrations, you can't add foreign keys and you can't do joins, for example. We also need to do that transparently, as in if we make this change, at least in my opinion, we shouldn't have to require, 300 something developers to now suddenly do some extra steps. And it should be also something that's transparent to production, because whatever approach we take, whether it's schemas, database, or something else, it's going to be a while before we deploy it. The schema approach there is one where at the start of your tests, for example, you could change the schema of these tables and then flip them back. My concern mostly there is we haven't really tested this in any capacity with PG bouncer, the load balancer, etc. And theoretically, you can cheat. So if we have a setup where we move certain tables to a different schema, then we also do this during your development environment. Somebody could essentially cheat the system by just changing their search path, and then they can join all they want, as far as I understand, at least. Now,
Yes,
I don't
like we use that for the partitions. We use a full qualified name that prefix the table name with the schema, and this is how we use GitLab partition static dynamic, and we don't set search path, and like this is how we kind of create analyze partitions today.
Right.
So this is the simplest way to cheat.
Right. So it is possible. I don't expect people would do this deliberately. And I think when they do, you basically slap them on the fingers. But the sort of core concern that I have basically is I prefer having a solution where it's physically impossible and not it is unlikely. Simply because the harder guarantees are better. So I think in upcoming Rails versions, for example, you can disable joins at the per model level, because GitHub was blogging about this a few days ago, where they were doing apparently very similar stuff to us. Or I guess the other way around, because they started first. Something like that, I think, would be very useful, because then essentially we could do at the model level, we could say, hey, this model can't join. Just, you can't do it. And I think then we're basically done. Of course, you have foreign keys, but at least the joining part is fixed. So it becomes a separate query. Code that requires a join will break, which means we have to fix it. It shows up in the tests. It's very clear. Instead of this sort of behind-the-scenes system where you're not really aware of it until you run into something. Whereas, at least I personally prefer basically this explicit thing somewhere that says you can't do this. Like, it just physically won't work. With that said, I don't know if there's a way to backport that stuff to our version of Rails.
What is a PR? Do you have an interest?
Let me quickly look up the GitHub blog post.
Because GitHub blog post mentioned disable joins feature, and we actually backported that, and we are using that in the POC.
Ah, we are. Yeah, I think it might have been that one. I can't find it. My history is full of GitHub Copilot stuff, so it's somewhere in the pile. But somebody shared it in the Sharding channel a few days ago. I think it might have been Jarth.
But it's like like what it offers is fairly limited, and it works only in the specific cases. Even like if you use this syntax, you can still like cross join. If you do, let's say, dot joins, for example, you can still cross join. So it kind of limits a very, so it doesn't even limit. It kind of like changes a behavior when you are using that in a very particular syntax. So if you, for example, use .includes with the disable join, it still will be join. It will not use separate queries. For that, you need to use explicitly .preload. So this is more like a handy feature to a guide that some of the syntax are not allowed, but this is not a security feature that kind of forbids things.
All right, I was under the impression that basically everything except a raw SQL query would go through this logic, and Rails would say, can't join. Yeah, if it doesn't do that, then
yes, like
it's not really an option.
I started adding some additional patch on the eager loading to prevent that, but it still like doesn't cover all cases technically. It's still like it's more like the like a hint, but not a security feature that you kind of looking for.
So in that case, with the schemas, what we could do in theory is we have sort of two options. One, we take a set of tables and we say these now live in the CI schema. And we add a migration that does that. As far as I understand, this is sort of an instant change. You can do it in production, no problem. I do think for that, we should somehow test how PG Bouncer works with this, with its connection pooling and how the load balancer reacts. I think the load balancer will probably be fine. PG Bouncer, I'm not sure if you set the search path globally or per connection. I saw some stuff being discussed about it. But basically, that may require that prior to us deploying such a migration, we first have to change PG Bouncer to include, let's say, not just the CI search path, but maybe a couple of others just ahead of time. Unless changing that is trivial, then we can just do the CI schema.
So from what we tested and from what I saw, Patrick, and correct me if I'm wrong, like we don't have a very reliable way of on the PG Bouncer level, even though there are commands, but they are treated as executed on the best effort. But what appears that we can do, we can alter a role or alter database and set a default search path. So basically append our schema search path to the either role or database. So technically, from what I understood from Patrick, this would require that we have to cycle all the outgoing connections from the PG Bouncer to ensure that they fetch like a new thing out of that. I think what I learned as well that like this race configuration database YML schema search path is simply no go because it's very unpredictable and it simply will fail on the PG Bouncer and we cannot guarantee anything. But from what I kind of see right now, the alter solution should be pretty stable, especially if you can apply that on the given database.
Right, but so in practice, that basically means that in production, you would theoretically be able to join across these schemas because they are in the default search path. Correct me if I'm wrong there. And it would just be something that we enforce in the testing and development environments.
Actually, Andreas proposed some very good idea. Like if at some point, as an intermediate step, we could open two separate connections to the same logical database, and knowing all the implications on the performance, what we could have these different connections by default by a role configured to have different schema path. So then, like we could probably temporarily feature flag and model on the same logical database, let's say different queries being executed with different search paths to ensure that we don't have any ones for like violating these search paths on the insert on the right path of the application.
Right. I think you would never want to be using an explicit search path or fully qualified table names. So basically, if you only rely on search path being correct, then you can only work with CI tables if you have it configured that way, or with the main schema if you have it configured the other way. But if you never use explicit schema names, then there is like less risk of cheating, right, across schemas. And like Kamil explained, if you have those two separate connections, assuming we can set that up in production, we can even switch things much more incrementally to using the separate CI connection. So even with a feature flag, even for our group only, we could say that, yeah, okay, now we're using the CI connection and we can see if a certain code path actually works if it doesn't see any of the other tables that are not inside the CI schema. That is something where I see a huge benefit compared to having to wait until we actually migrate data physically to a separate database, and only then realizing that, yeah, there is some code paths that still don't work, that we still haven't caught, basically. Because then this is sort of a big bang migration where the rollback is very expensive, at least, like if at all possible, really. Whereas when we use schemas, we can really, if we want that, right, we can do very small steps, we can enable it in production, and we can also easily roll it back. The only drawback is we would have to have a separate connection being set up. That entails PG bouncer being set up, and it also means that since we're talking about connections to the same database, it means that those additional connections are going to go to the same single Postgres cluster that we have today, and that is an additional overhead, most likely. That is an unknown, I think, that we would have to check.
Yeah, I think the benefit there will be that those connections would, I would imagine, mostly sit around idle, unless we're actively using them. So I think that should be fine. So put it this way, I am still a little uncertain, but that is not so much because of schemas, but more because I kind of look at this and like, why is there not a better way? Like I'm basically a little disappointed in the sort of state of, I guess, Rails and Postgres, probably because there's not a lot of people who run into this. Anyway, given that the Rails joining solution that I had hoped would be helpful is not as helpful, and given that, you know, writing Rubocop rules or whatever is probably going to be total pain and not detect everything, it seems like schemas might be the best approach. I think the sort of big asterisk there is we just have to make sure it works in PG Bouncer before we commit a lot of time to this, because it's a bit of a waste if we do all these migrations, set that up, and then we deploy through our production environment. It's like, oh no, PG Bouncer just doesn't work with this. Sorry. Although in that case, I think you could do this thing where you say, oh, like if you're in development, we use schema CI and otherwise schema public, but I'm not sure how that translates into our structure.sql files if they start mentioning these things explicitly. But anyway, I would say let's give it a try, basically.
Yes, the tricky part about the public is like that we don't control if this is public.
It can be any name, and we've had that before where people were configuring whatever schema they thought it can be, like it can be GitLab or something. But due to the fact that we're not even explicit about using schema names again, it still works. But you just can't assume that public is the default schema.
So at least from my perspective, like I consider schema to some extent be a risk. Well, this is probably like a worth try. And if it just doesn't work, we can fall back to what we know, which is like structure and drop tables simply. And this is like our fallback strategy then.
Another way, that's why I was asking about self-managed. I wasn't quite sure, like I think I caught somewhere that basically having a separate database is an optional step even for self-managed. So even if they want to do that, or only if they want to do that, they would have a separate database. And in that case, I can even imagine that if you keep, if you have schemas and you logically divide your tables into those schemas, for those installations that don't have a separate database, you would be able to just keep having one connection pool, basically, that has a very permissive search path where you can actually see all those tables. And basically nothing would change for those installations. They would keep having one database. There is no migration needed whatsoever, which is probably quite difficult in a self-managed setup to do the data migration to a separate database with no downtime. So in that case, we wouldn't need to do anything about self-managed, and they can opt into having a separate database. Is that the plan, offering sort of a separate database as an opt-in solution for self-managed, or did I get that wrong?
So about the self-managed, like we didn't yet define exactly how we're gonna run that, but one of the suggestions from Seed and like expectation is like that we run self-managed exactly the same as we run production. So this may imply on the same database server having separate logical databases, but at least I would expect that we want to end up in the solution that we use separate connections anyway, to not like run that all in the single big transactions, because then what happens is like on GitLab.com, we start running transactions across two different databases. But if we keep main with very permissive search path, all of these transactions will be basically joined together now. So your on-premise versus GitLab.com will behave slightly differently, because GitLab.com will run this sequentially. On-premise will basically run that on the database level together. So I think the way how we end up on running on-premise is that we truly have to embrace that even on the on-premise, even if this is same database, it may be same logical database, but different search path, whatever we choose, we keep running two separate connections to ensure that it behaves exactly the same as GitLab.com, as for the all two-phase commit stuff that we are kind of gonna be forbidding. This would be like my like understanding about the seed expectations. It's like it's less relevant about if these are like the data are together or not together, if they are separate logical databases or separate servers. There is like this structural choice from the application that it runs across two different connections. So this is the mechanic I think that we should retain to ensure that it behaves exactly the same as GitLab.com.
Okay, that makes sense. And regarding the data migration into a separate database, is that something that you're also aiming to ship to self-managed, so they can also do that?
We did not yet discuss that. It's something after we finish that, but I think like out of the things that like were in my head and probably written in the issue is probably that we could offer like a boring offline solution, just copy data over with the downtime as a very first step. Or maybe we just document our way how we do that, which is like with the streaming application. And there is like many options for that, but I think that the main goal is really like that on-premise runs exactly the same way application as GitLab.com.
Okay, so to summarize, we're unblocked on this. We can move forward with schema. That's pretty much a summary. All right, on to number 2, Fabian.
Oh yeah, I thank you for responding to my issue request. I perceive a certain level of frustration in the responses, and I can relate. The context for this request is that the discussion on decomposition and the concerns raised by Sid regarding this particular MR for normalization were reopened on Monday. I have so far, I think, failed to convey that these are not concerns. And I've tried to represent the opinion of the team faithfully. So my intent here is to sort of close this out, because I don't think this is a significant concern. And I appreciate that this is an additional request, and we've talked about it before. But that's where I'm coming from. So this is kind of where we are at. And I think my interpretation of where we are at with regards to decomposition, right, and unrelated to this normalizing of data and this particular MR, is that I don't think decomposition closes the door definitely on future sharding strategies. I think that is not the case. And secondly, normalization and the denormalization of sharding will be a large part of the work that has to happen. And this particular MR is one of many, does not add significant overhead. It is a problem that we will have to deal with regardless. That is how it is in my mind. And for those reasons, I believe it should be fine, but I have so far failed to convey that in a way that is helpful. And I hope that by having this sort of track record written down, it can help sort of alleviate those concerns. Does that make sense? That's it.
Yeah, basically like this sort of normalization that's been said before, but yeah, the answer is depends on what we normalize and how. In general, no, we will always have shared tables to some extent, and having shared tables itself is fine. Like if you want everything fully isolated, you end up basically with a federated GitLab, which is in itself a very interesting feature, but
yes,
it's not what we have today, and I don't think we'll ever be able to build it.
But I think this is sort of my point, is like, I don't think we are clear yet on what we're going to build in the next 2 or 3 years. But that is sort of TBD. You know, we don't have a definite answer as to what that would entail. But the situation is such that what we're doing right now is not closing the door on many of these futures, because we have shared tables. We will have to deal with them. That is a part of the work that will need to happen. And so I think that is important. There's no one-way door that here is closed, and with this one MR, all of a sudden we are no longer able to shard in the future, or it is a significant increase of burden, right? Because it's one of many. And I also agree with you, and I think that was not really made apparent so far, is that we reduced a lot of data. And if you have less data, it becomes easier to handle that on some level. So that's that.
I mean, like technically from different angle, like if you have 1 gigabyte worth of table that you have to then denormalize, it's probably pretty straightforward thing to do, because this is only 1 gig instead of processing 1 terabyte of data.
Yes, I agree with you. And then the second thing is that the decomposition effort, right? The taking all of the CI tables and putting them in a different database is not making it impossible to shard by whatever strategy later on, as far as I understand, right? It's like, of course we have 2 databases and we will need to deal with it, but it's not, we've not, if we continue down that line, we're not going to be in a state where some kind of sharding strategy will not be possible anymore. That's sort of my interpretation. And I'm not sure what else I can say, quite frankly.
I would even say that, like, if you decompose, it's much easier to shard, because you are sharding smaller data set, much more contained. You have to figure out better sharding strategy, and you actually sharding like small portion, or maybe big portion, because of the decomposed block of the application, not affecting others. So it's much easier to optimize and do it iteratively, instead of doing one or all or nothing effectively, as with everything.
Yes.
Can I add for what we're doing here with the normalization is a lookup table, basically, and that's a good strategy in a relational model in any case. So a good practice where we are right now. But even if we go into sharding, then nothing keeps you from having lookup tables in sharding. You just want to make sure that you have the right data on your shard, and it doesn't have to be a shared global lookup table, right? So that means you lose some benefits because you have more duplicated data potentially, but you can still make that. You can still reap the benefits of that normalization in a sharded environment. So
yeah, and I think that's a good point. And if you can add that to the context, it would help me, because that, like, it's important to have this sort of track record. But I think it's also, for me, and I think I raised this, is like, I think there's a fundamental question sort of in the longer term architecture of GitLab, like Jorik said, where maybe we want fully isolated tenants at some point. And if that is the case, it will break, certain functionality that we have right now, or make it very, very difficult to do. Yeah, GitLab pods. But that's a call based on our on our desire for single tenancy and whatnot, right? And nothing that we do right now, in like as I interpret it, and you have to tell me if this is wrong, will make it impossible to deliver such a thing if we choose to do so, and if that is the desire. Even though I don't know if that is the desire, because it's a completely different way of how our product works right now. And some things will not be possible as easily as they are right now, and some other things aren't. That's a trade-off that we will have to consider, in my mind. If I thought about it yesterday a little bit, where if a large customer on our SaaS offering is not interested in, having displayed activity across, like all of the open source projects, right? And they just want their own little world, and that's fine, then okay, we're going to break that functionality, and that's how it's going to be, but we don't know if that's the case. And that's a longer term question.
Yes, but like you are raising the conflicting point, I think. Is it really like we are talking about the tenants? So like making efficient to run tenants, or do we talk about the regions, which may seems like you run in the Europe versus US? Because both of these are kind of like two different problems to solve.
I agree, and my point,
they are very similar, but tenant gonna live very close to all your other tenants, but regions is like running across Atlantic or whatever else.
That's correct. That was my point. I think they're fundamentally different problem spaces with different requirements. It is true, though, that if you had something that allows you to run pods of something, you could move them to a region, and that would be okay. But the thing is that, like, what I'm also saying is like they can be related, but they're not requiring each other. There are other ways of realizing regions, because we could spin up a completely isolated instance in Europe, and if that solves the regional requirements, that's a valid strategy. And I think the other thing to note, and I've said that before, is if there's a market need for regions now, and we want to get that implemented within the next year, then making it dependent on some form of fully working sharding or pod architecture means that we will not have regions until that is done, which is going to take a very long time. So there are different things, or there can be different things.
Yes, but I think there are different solutions, because from the cost perspective, like regions gonna be significantly larger instance. On a tenant, yes, you really want to have a cost of a single tenant as small as possible. And it's like even like from your investment, like you're gonna be investing different amount of the money on running also.
That's correct.
So like Slack example shows they don't do regions, they do tenants, and they move from tenant equals database to many tenants on a single database that is like sharded. So this is different solution than regions, but regions would be basically Slack.io that they kind of replicate all the infrastructure and like do all of that stuff that they are doing in the .com.
I agree. And I think on some level, maybe Sid agrees as well, because within the first 5 minutes of the meeting, the proposal was renamed from GitLab regions to GitLab pods, which has slightly different scope, right? So, that was maybe a bit difficult to follow. In any
Because
case,
like for tenant, you would really like run everything on the same application, just with some way of filtering that. Okay, I'm gonna stop, please.
Yeah. But that's where we are. Like what I will try to do is summarize, your points in this issue in like 3 sentences, and share that. I think that's the best I can do. I know it's a distraction on some level. I still think we need to work through that.
I think what the part is describing in that doc, Sid is trying to solve multiple problems with one solution. That's where we are. And that's what I think we have different opinion, because we believe the problems should be isolated, solved by different solutions. I think that's where we diverge from the opinion. And there are 2 ways we handle that. Macro level, I mean, at a high level, we probably want to explain that's probably not a good idea to solve multiple problems with one solution. That will make this one solution really big, complicated. At the macro level, I mean, technical level, I typed my suggestion there about sharding itself. Draw a picture of how it looks like if we shard by top level namespace in the future. And also then draw a picture, a rough picture, or tell the story. We have not decided our sharding direction yet. So many possibilities with two-door decision, two-way decisions, right? So that may help explain the sharding solution, but I think the path is a much higher level. We're trying to solve all the problems with one solution.
Yeah, I think you're not wrong, Jun. I think I'm just at the, like, I've drawn so many of these pictures by now. It's difficult to figure out how to do it better. I think it's actually a good suggestion. I'll try to summarize it again. I think there's fundamentally, to be perfectly frank, I think I've not personally found a good way of saying this in such a way that results in Sid agreeing. And I'm trying to find a way to do that in order for us to be able to move on with what we're doing. And I think that this issue was our idea yesterday on how to get some of that data written down, and that already I think is very helpful. I think this picture is another idea of doing it. I do think though, and this is important for you to know, I don't think you should do anything like Jorik and Camille or Andreas, right? Continue on your path, and Patrick, because it takes a lot of effort, and I think I'm hoping to get it resolved.
Sorry, go ahead.
No, please, Jorik.
I was gonna ask, so we keep, like, we talk about GitLab regions, we talk about GitLab pods, we talk about, hey, we want to isolate things so that people can have their data in God knows where, but still use GitLab.com. Do we actually have people willing to pay a considerable amount of money for this? Because as far as I understand, the people that we use GitLab.com, they don't want their stuff isolated. They use GitLab.com because other projects are there.
Yeah.
And the people that want to have their data isolated, like say a government, first of all, they're not going to use the SaaS anyway, because that's probably against all their regulations. And if they are, it's probably going to be something like Amazon's, was it GovNet or whatever, but it's basically entirely separate Amazon. Or they will use GitLab Private, which is, I guess, basically that. I just, and this is maybe me being a developer and not, a sales product person, whatever. I honest to
Please
God,
don't put sales and product in one head. That will make my
people who talk to other people. I honest to God, I don't see the use case for signing up for GitLab.com and then saying, I want all my data in the EU but I don't care about my logs and these things GitLab has decided not to localize. But I still want to be able to interact with non-EU projects, and I still want to have non-EU people interact with my projects. Because you get this sort of muddy gray area where whatever regulations they're perhaps trying to follow are like questionable.
Yeah, so I agree with you. Like this is what I essentially stated. It's like we're doing decomposition now. We still need to determine how we're going to shard, right? Because we don't know. We don't know what the business case for regions is. We have no detailed understanding of these requirements for this target segment. And we should do exactly what you just suggested and actually that out before we do anything, because I cannot answer these questions. And if I cannot answer these questions, then how are you supposed to know what to implement, quite frankly? That is my stance. So I think, you know, there is a significant piece of sort of discovery to be done for regions, right? And maybe even more broadly for tenant isolation, because I think that will have a very big impact on the architectural decisions where we want to take GitLab. And if once we have clarity on that, you know, it will, I think, help us determine the right kind of, you know, solutions for these requirements. They can look very different. And so that is my stance. And luckily, I think we're not blocked on anything because some of these efforts can be parallelized, right? You can do the decomposition. It actually buys us a significant amount of time, you know, with database scalability and whatnot. And yeah, I think we are in full agreement on that, personally. I think that is what needs to happen. And I don't think we are at a point where, like, we can say with confidence, do Vitesse and we will solve our regions problems and our sharding problems and our scalability problems, or do GitLab pods and we'll solve all of our problems, because I think we have not done all of the work necessary to, like, from a customer perspective, to determine this, because there are trade-offs. I don't think there is a single solution that will magically solve all of these problems at once without any trade-offs to consider. So I agree.
Fabian, there is one thing that we are, I think, certain, like, we need to do partitioning of our tables. And this is rather sooner than later. So as soon as we have that, then like sharding with the database technology gonna be easier. So I think this is one thing that we are kind of certain that this is what we need to do.
Yeah, and I think we also, know, and please again correct me if I'm wrong here, that the ongoing decomposition work, when it completes, will provide us significant headroom for future growth. And I think that is, in my mind, why we also chose this, because it is something that we can deliver in a relatively, let's say, short amount of time, which then buys us a lot of the time needed to make all of these considerations and investigate them in an appropriate way. You know, if we have no headroom left, then there's no time to consider it. And so I honestly think we're doing exactly the right thing. I just need to convince Sid and others that that is the case, quite frankly, if that makes sense. And this is where so to make full circle, and then we can close, and this is where this issue request is coming from, because I'm in the position where I'm not a developer, right? I can point at your expertise to answering these questions, right? It's not in my remit to say, Fabian has read many books on relational databases and thinks this is like that, right? I think that's not my point.
I think that I agree with you. Like, you need to choose a solution based on the problem. And right now, we don't know what problem we are trying to solve. So it's really hard to propose the solution.
Well, I think we are trying to solve all problems at once.
And like, even for the regions, we could probably deploy another GitLab and like be fine with the current architecture for a very long time, just sharing some of the data on a very small portion. So then the question is really what is the problem that we are trying to solve?
Yes, I agree with you. Anyways, that's the context, and I'm really glad and grateful for all of your support in that. Please don't think otherwise, and I hope I'm not causing more frustration than necessary. Sorry, that went 15 minutes over the scheduled time.
My item can be async, so no need to discuss. Yeah, we can do that asynchronously.
Cool. Thank you.
Thank you.